Picture this. You wake up one morning, look out your window, and the entire neighborhood across the street has vanished without a trace. No rubble, no explanation, just empty ocean where land used to be. Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to thousands of people in 1692 when an entire city literally disappeared into the sea in a matter of minutes. And this isn't some ancient legend or folklore. This is documented history that defied everything people thought they knew about the natural world. Welcome back to 2 a.m. Brain Cell, where we dive deep into the mysteries that shaped our world. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of the most shocking geological disasters in recorded history, the complete and sudden disappearance of Port Royal, Jamaica. This wasn't just any ordinary town that slipped into the ocean. This was the most notorious pirate haven in the Caribbean, home to legendary buccaneers, untold riches, and secrets that still lie buried beneath the waves today. But here's where it gets really interesting. The people who witnessed this catastrophe described something that modern science is only now beginning to understand. They spoke of the earth turning liquid, of buildings sinking like stones through solid ground, and an entire civilization being swallowed by forces that seemed almost supernatural. What they were actually witnessing was one of the first documented cases of large-scale soil liquefaction, a phenomenon so rare and devastating that it would take scientists centuries to fully comprehend what had happened that fateful day. Now, before we dive into the incredible story of how an entire island city vanished in minutes, I want you to imagine living in the late 1600s. There's no internet, no television, no way to quickly communicate with the outside world. News travels by ship, taking weeks or months to reach distant shores. So when something truly extraordinary happens, it becomes the stuff of legend almost immediately. And Port Royal's disappearance was so extraordinary, so completely unbelievable, that many people refused to accept the eyewitness accounts for decades. The story begins in the early 1600s when European powers were racing to establish footholds in the Caribbean. Spain had dominated the region for over a century, but their grip was beginning to weaken as other nations sought their share of New World riches. Enter the English, who captured Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655 and immediately recognized the strategic importance of its southern coast. They established Port Royal on a small peninsula called the Palisadoes, creating what would become the most important English stronghold in the Caribbean. But Port Royal wasn't destined to become just another colonial outpost. Its location at the mouth of Kingston Harbor made it a perfect base for something far more lucrative and dangerous: piracy. The English authorities, locked in constant conflict with Spain, saw an opportunity to use pirates as unofficial naval forces against their enemies. They issued letters of marque, essentially government licenses to steal from Spanish ships and settlements, turning Port Royal into the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy. And what a capital it was! By the 1680s, Port Royal had grown into one of the largest English cities in the Americas, rivaling even Boston and New York in size and importance. But unlike those northern cities, Port Royal had developed a reputation that was equal parts legendary and notorious. This was where the most famous pirate of the age made their home base: Henry Morgan, Calico Jack, and dozens of other buccaneers whose names struck fear into Spanish merchants across the Caribbean. The wealth flowing through Port Royal was absolutely staggering. Spanish treasure fleets carrying silver from Peru and Mexico were regularly intercepted by pirates operating out of the port. The city became a massive fence operation where stolen goods were sold, traded, and redistributed throughout the English colonies. Merchants, both legitimate and otherwise, flocked to Port Royal to participate in this incredibly profitable gray market economy. But it wasn't just the pirates who made Port Royal wealthy. The city's strategic location made it a crucial hub for all Caribbean trade. Sugar plantations across Jamaica shipped their products through Port Royal's harbor. Slaves were brought through its markets. European goods arrived to supply the growing English colonies. In many ways, Port Royal had become the New York City of the Caribbean, a bustling cosmopolitan center where fortunes were made and lost daily. The city's rapid growth was reflected in its architecture and infrastructure. By 1692, Port Royal boasted over 2,000 buildings packed onto just 51 acres of land. This wasn't some ramshackle pirate town. It was a sophisticated urban center with multi-story brick buildings, elaborate mansions, churches, taverns, and shops. The population density was incredible, with an estimated 6,500 to 10,000 people living in an area smaller than many modern city blocks. But here's where the story takes an ominous turn. Port Royal was built on what geologists now recognize as some of the most unstable ground imaginable. The Palisados Peninsula was essentially a large sandbar, composed of loose sand and gravel that had been deposited by ocean currents over thousands of years. This type of foundation is particularly susceptible to a phenomenon called liquefaction, where saturated sandy soil essentially turns into quicksand during seismic activity. The people of Port Royal had no understanding of these geological risks. To them, the peninsula seemed like solid ground, perfect for building a major city. They constructed their buildings directly on the sand, with minimal foundations, never suspecting that they were literally building on quicksand waiting for the right trigger to activate. That trigger came on June 7, 1692, at precisely 11:43 in the morning. It started with what witnesses described as a gentle rolling motion, almost like being on a ship in calm seas. People initially thought little of it. Minor earthquakes were not uncommon in Jamaica, but within seconds, the gentle rolling transformed into violent shaking that would continue for nearly 3 minutes. What happened next defied everything the residents thought they knew about solid ground. The sandy soil beneath Port Royal, saturated with seawater and destabilized by the earthquake's vibrations, underwent massive liquefaction. In simple terms, the ground turned into liquid. Buildings didn't just collapse. They sank straight down into what had moments before been solid earth. Eyewitness accounts from survivors paint a picture of almost supernatural horror. The Reverend Emmanuel Heath, who was in Port Royal that morning, wrote that he saw the earth open and swallow up people, and the sea mounting in upon us over the fortifications. He described watching entire streets simply vanish, with houses, people, and animals disappearing into gaps that opened in the liquefied ground. Another survivor, Dr. Emmanuel Heath, reported seeing the ground roll like the waves of the sea. He watched as a man running toward him suddenly disappeared when the earth opened beneath his feet, then closed again, leaving no trace that the person had ever existed. Buildings that had stood for decades sank completely out of sight in a matter of minutes, as if they had never been built. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. In just 3 minutes, approximately 2/3 of Port Royal simply vanished. The northern section of the city, containing over 1,300 buildings, slid into Kingston Harbor and disappeared beneath 40 feet of water. The death toll was catastrophic. Between 1,500 and 3,000 people died immediately, with thousands more injured or made homeless. But the immediate earthquake and liquefaction were only the beginning of Port Royal's nightmare. The seismic activity triggered a massive tsunami that struck the already devastated city just minutes after the initial quake. Waves estimated at 6 feet high swept over what remained the peninsula, carrying away debris, bodies, and any survivors who had managed to escape the liquefaction. The tsunami wasn't just a local phenomenon. Waves generated by the earthquake and underwater landslides traveled across the Caribbean, striking coastlines hundreds of miles away. Ships in Kingston Harbor reported being lifted and spun by the massive waves, while coastal settlements throughout Jamaica experienced flooding and damage. In the immediate aftermath, survivors faced a hellish landscape. Where the bustling city center had stood just minutes before, there was now nothing but churning water filled with debris and bodies. The few buildings that remained standing were severely damaged and in danger of collapse. The harbor was clogged with wreckage, making rescue efforts nearly impossible. Disease followed quickly on the heels of destruction. With so many bodies trapped under water and debris, and with the city's sanitation systems completely destroyed, cholera and other waterborne illnesses spread rapidly among the survivors. Some estimates suggest that disease killed as many people in the weeks following the disaster as the earthquake itself had claimed. News of Port Royal's destruction spread slowly across the Caribbean and eventually to Europe. But when it did arrive, many people simply refused to believe the accounts. The idea that an entire city could disappear in minutes seemed impossible to 17th century minds. Some dismissed the reports as exaggerated tales told by traumatized survivors. Others saw a divine intervention in the disaster, interpreting it as God's judgment on a city renowned for its wickedness and sin. Religious leaders across the English colonies seized on Port Royal's destruction as a powerful example of divine retribution. Sermons were preached from Boston to Barbados, describing how God had punished the Sodom of the Caribbean for its sins. The city's association with piracy, prostitution, and general lawlessness made it an easy target for moral condemnation. Some preachers claimed that the earthquake had been specifically targeted at Port Royal because of its inhabitants' ungodly behavior. But while religious authorities proclaimed divine justice, survivors and witnesses knew they had experienced something that defied easy explanation. Their descriptions of the ground turning liquid, a building sinking straight down rather than toppling over, and the earth opening and closing like a mouth were so unusual that they challenged contemporary understanding of how earthquakes worked. Modern geological investigation has revealed that Port Royal's destruction was caused by one of the most dramatic examples of earthquake-induced liquefaction ever recorded. The combination of saturated sandy soil, high water table, and severe seismic shaking created perfect conditions for ground to lose all structural integrity. When liquefaction occurs, solid ground essentially becomes a thick liquid, unable to support any weight. Scientists have studied core samples from the submerged portions of Port Royal and found clear evidence of this liquefaction process. Layers of sand show the characteristic mixing and flow patterns that occur when soil turns liquid. Artifacts and building remains are found scattered throughout these disturbed layers, providing physical proof of how the city sank rather than simply collapsed. The underwater archaeology of Port Royal has revealed incredible preserved evidence of 17th century life. Because the city sank so quickly, many buildings and artifacts were essentially flash frozen in time. Archaeologists have recovered everything from pewter plates still sitting on tables to bottles of wine with their corks still intact. Personal belongings, tools, weapons, and even food remain to provide an unprecedented window into daily life in the Caribbean's most notorious city. Perhaps most remarkably, the rapid sinking and subsequent burial in sand and silt created anaerobic conditions that perfectly preserved organic materials that would normally decay within years. Wooden building timbers, leather goods, textiles, and even human remains have been found in remarkable condition, offering scientists detailed information about construction techniques, trade goods, and life in 17th century Port Royal. The treasure aspect of Port Royal's story has captured imagination for centuries, and with good reason. As the primary base for Caribbean piracy, the city was home to enormous amounts of stolen Spanish gold and silver. When Port Royal sank, all that wealth went down with it. Modern estimates suggest that millions of dollars worth of precious metals and gems lie buried beneath Kingston Harbor. Treasure hunting at Port Royal has been ongoing since shortly after the disaster, but the site's protected status as both an archaeological preserve and a grave site has limited large-scale salvage operations. The few authorized excavations have recovered significant amounts of coins, jewelry, and precious objects, confirming that substantial wealth remains buried in the submerged ruins. But the real treasure of Port Royal isn't gold or silver. It's the unprecedented archaeological record of a complete 17th century city, preserved exactly as it existed at the moment of destruction. No other site in the Americas offers such a detailed snapshot of colonial life, making Port Royal one of the most important underwater archaeological sites in the world. The lessons learned from studying Port Royal's destruction have had profound implications for modern earthquake science and urban planning. The disaster demonstrated how liquefaction could completely destroy cities built on unstable ground, leading to new understanding of seismic risks in coastal areas. Cities around the world have implemented building codes and foundation requirements specifically designed to prevent the kind of catastrophic failure that destroyed Port Royal. Today, the remnants of Port Royal exist both above and below water. A small fishing village occupies part of the original peninsula, while the submerged portions of the city remain largely intact beneath Kingston Harbor. The site serves as both a sobering reminder of natural forces and a unique window into the Caribbean's most fascinating historical period. The story of Port Royal's disappearance continues to captivate people more than 3 centuries after the disaster. It represents a perfect convergence of natural catastrophe, historical significance, and human drama that resonates across time. The fact that an entire civilization could vanish in minutes serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly human achievements can be erased by forces beyond our control. Yet Port Royal's legacy extends far beyond its dramatic destruction. The city played a crucial role in shaping Caribbean history, serving as a bridge between the Spanish colonial period and the later English dominance of the region. Its unique position as both a legitimate trading center and a pirate haven reflected the complex realities of colonial life in the Americas. The disappearance of Port Royal marked the end of the golden age of Caribbean piracy. Without their primary base, the great pirate fleets that had terrorized Spanish shipping for decades gradually disbanded or moved to less convenient locations. The English authorities, sobered by the disaster and changing political circumstances, began to crack down on the very pirates they had once encouraged. In many ways, the sinking of Port Royal represents a turning point in Caribbean history, the moment when the wild and anarchic frontier period gave way to more conventional colonial rule. The city that had embodied the spirit of adventure, danger, and limitless possibility was replaced by the more prosaic but stable Kingston, which became Jamaica's new commercial center. The mystery and tragedy of Port Royal continue to inspire writers, filmmakers, and historians. Its story has become a powerful metaphor for hubris and divine retribution, for temporary nature-human achievement, and for the awesome power of natural forces. But beyond the symbolism, Port Royal remains a real place where real people lived, worked, loved, and died in one of history's most dramatic natural disasters. As we look back on this incredible story of a city that disappeared overnight, we're reminded that our modern world, for all its technological sophistication, remains vulnerable to the same natural forces that destroyed Port Royal. The lessons learned from studying this disaster continue to inform how we build cities, prepare for earthquakes, and understand the complex relationship between human civilization and the natural world. The secret island that vanished in 1692 may be gone, but its story continues to teach us about resilience, risk, and the enduring human spirit that drives us to build and rebuild in the face of unimaginable challenges.